The Jedi Council's failure to arrest Chancellor Palpatine earlier in the Clone Wars resulted from a convergence of political, structural, epistemological, and procedural forces documented across the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars. The Council did not lack suspicion regarding Palpatine's growing power. Instead, they operated within a system that prevented decisive action, and their own institutional assumptions restricted their ability to interpret evidence objectively. Early in Attack of the Clones, the Council acknowledged that the dark side had obscured their ability to sense threats. Yoda explicitly stated that their vision was clouded. This impairment reduced their confidence in identifying specific sources of corruption. Although they sensed an unseen adversary, they lacked the clarity necessary to initiate action against a political figure of Palpatine's stature. Palpatine acquired authority through legally sanctioned means, primarily via Senate votes granting emergency powers. Because his consolidation of power occurred through democratic procedure, the Jedi lacked constitutional justification to challenge him. Arresting a leader acting under lawful authority would have constituted a direct violation of the Republic Charter, exposing the Jedi to charges of treason. The Chancellor's public image further insulated him. He was widely perceived as a stabilizing force during a period of escalating conflict. Public approval created an environment where accusations against him required an extraordinarily high evidentiary standard. The Jedi could not produce such evidence without direct proof of Sith affiliation, which Palpatine concealed meticulously. The war created conditions that diverted Jedi attention. With thousands of battlefronts active simultaneously, the Order deployed nearly all available personnel. The resulting fragmentation reduced the Council's ability to conduct centralized investigation. This operational saturation allowed Palpatine to implement policy shifts with minimal scrutiny. The Jedi's epistemic assumptions played a significant role in their delay. For centuries, they believed the Sith operated clandestinely and avoided political visibility. Because Palpatine occupied the most public political position in the Republic, the Council did not initially consider him a viable suspect. Their interpretive framework hindered objective analysis. Institutional credibility further constrained them. The Jedi Order relied on public trust to maintain its role as guardian of the Republic. Any premature accusation could jeopardize their legitimacy. Mace Windu's concerns in Revenge of the Sith highlight this tension. He acknowledged the thin line between defending the Republic and seizing political power. The Council recognized that misinterpreting Palpatine's motives could irreparably damage their standing. The Jedi also understood that the clone army answered to the Chancellor. If they attempted to arrest him without overwhelming justification, they risked turning the entire military against the Order. This dependence on an army they did not commission created a structural vulnerability that Palpatine exploited. Anakin Skywalker's relationship with Palpatine created additional complications. As the Chancellor's protégé, Anakin provided Palpatine with insight into Council deliberations, while limiting the Council's insight into Palpatine's private conduct. Anakin's emotional volatility made the Council hesitant to share suspicions with him, but excluding him risked damaging his trust. This dilemma constrained Council strategy. The Jedi's late recognition of the Sith threat stemmed not from naivety, but from methodological limitations. Without direct evidence of Sith involvement, they viewed Palpatine primarily as an overreaching politician rather than a Sith Lord. Even when Windu declared the Chancellor unfit for office, he relied on circumstantial reasoning based on Palpatine's refusal to surrender emergency powers. Key events in the Clone Wars reinforce this pattern. Dooku's manipulation, the inhibitor chip cover-up, and the Senate's political inertia created an environment where institutional checks failed repeatedly. The Jedi encountered disconnected signs of corruption, but lacked the informational cohesion necessary to form a complete diagnosis. Denial operated as a psychological buffer. The implications of a Sith Lord controlling the Republic were catastrophic. Accepting this possibility would require acknowledging that the Republic's democratic institutions had already collapsed. The Jedi hesitated to adopt a perspective that would delegitimize the very system they served. The Jedi frequently framed their concerns in political rather than metaphysical terms. Palpatine's policies were evaluated against wartime needs, not dark side influence. This framing error led the Council to interpret authoritarian expansion as a political phenomenon rather than a Sith-led conspiracy. Palpatine deliberately blurred these categories. The Jedi's decision-making was also influenced by hierarchical inertia. Large institutions resist drastic action without overwhelming consensus. Although several council members expressed concern about Palpatine's actions, collective agreement emerged only when Anakin revealed Palpatine was a Sith. Until that moment, dissenting opinions lacked the unanimity required for intervention. Diplomatic constraints further limited options. The Jedi could not interrogate or investigate Palpatine without Senate authorization. Any attempt to do so would undermine democratic structure. Palpatine's control over judicial bodies ensured that legal pathways for investigation were essentially closed. Procedurally, the Jedi lacked investigative authority. Their mandate centered on peacekeeping, not internal political oversight. When the crisis involving Palpatine emerged, the Order was forced to operate outside its traditional domain. This mismatch between institutional design and systemic threat produced paralysis. Operational fatigue also contributed to delayed action. Years of continuous warfare strained the Order's cognitive and strategic capacity. With casualties mounting, resources thinning, and morale declining, the Council lacked the bandwidth for long-term political analysis. Palpatine's strategy depended on this exhaustion. The Jedi were also constrained by their philosophical commitment to restraint. They avoided force in political matters unless absolutely necessary. This principle discouraged preemptive action, especially against a sitting chancellor. Their adherence to non-intervention reduced their responsiveness to emerging threats. The Council recognized the increasing danger, but believed they could manage it through observation rather than confrontation. This incremental approach proved ineffective because it failed to match the scale and pace of Palpatine's consolidation of power. Ultimately, the Jedi's delay resulted from structural entrapment. Palpatine created a political ecosystem where every institutional pathway led toward inaction. By the time the Jedi confirmed his identity, the Republic's legal, military, and public institutions were already aligned in his favor. Their failure was not perceptual, but procedural. The Jedi did not arrest Palpatine sooner because they operated within a system engineered to prevent such intervention. Their institutional design, political commitments, and interpretive assumptions made decisive action nearly impossible. Palpatine exploited these limitations comprehensively, ensuring the Jedi recognized the threat only when meaningful resistance was no longer viable. The Jedi Order's delayed action against Palpatine stemmed not from intellectual failure, but from structural disadvantages exploited by the Sith. Palpatine built a political environment where any attempt to arrest him would appear illegitimate. His strategy relied on turning the Republic's institutions into protective mechanisms that insulated him from scrutiny while directing suspicion toward the Jedi. Public confidence in Palpatine created a political shield. Throughout Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, the Senate consistently endorsed his decisions, including the extension of emergency powers and the continuation of the war. This consistent approval made opposition appear radical. Any Jedi intervention would have contradicted the Republic's democratic consensus. Palpatine also secured control over the clone army, ensuring that military force remained aligned with his interests. As Supreme Chancellor, he possessed the authority to issue military orders, including Order 66. The Jedi could not rely on the clones to support an arrest, which made any confrontation inherently dangerous. Their dependence on an army they did not command created an unavoidable vulnerability. The Jedi's intellectual framework further limited their ability to evaluate Palpatine accurately. For centuries, they assumed the Sith operated covertly, not through formal authority. This assumption made it difficult for the Council to interpret Palpatine's behavior as evidence of Sith involvement. They misclassified the threat because their doctrines emphasized clandestine activity, not institutional infiltration. Palpatine manipulated Anakin Skywalker to weaken the Council's strategic capacity. Anakin's position between Palpatine and the Jedi created an information imbalance. Palpatine used private conversations to shape Anakin's interpretation of the Council's motives, generating distrust. The Jedi recognized Anakin's importance, but failed to anticipate how thoroughly Palpatine had co-opted him. The Sith also exploited legal ambiguities in the Republic Charter. There was no established process for detaining a Chancellor acting under emergency powers. Palpatine's actions were authoritarian but procedurally valid. Because the Jedi lacked jurisdiction over political decisions, they had no legal foundation for arrest until Sith identity was confirmed. This made intervention dependent on high-risk confrontations. Palpatine structured the Clone Wars to increase his legitimacy. Every separatist attack, planetary crisis, or political emergency strengthened his authority and weakened the Jedi's. As the war progressed, Senate reliance on his leadership intensified. The Jedi increasingly appeared subordinate to political authority rather than independent guardians of peace. Their institutional identity eroded, reducing their ability to justify dissent. The Jedi's public image deteriorated due to wartime roles. Their position as generals shifted perceptions from neutral mediators to military operatives. Palpatine used this shift to depict them as competitors for power. His confrontation with Mace Windu in Revenge of the Sith reflected this narrative, as he claimed the Jedi were attempting a coup. Public skepticism of the Order made counteraction politically impossible. Operational secrecy within the Jedi Order also constrained their response. The Council withheld information from lower-ranking Jedi to preserve stability, but this created a fragmented understanding of Palpatine's rise. Individual Jedi witnessed signs of corruption, but without organizational synthesis, these observations remained isolated. Palpatine capitalized on this compartmentalization. Repeated political failures reinforced the perception that the Jedi lacked authority to intervene. Efforts to limit Palpatine's emergency powers stalled due to Senate loyalty. The Council observed the growing imbalance but had no viable mechanism to reverse it. They chose observational strategies because institutional pathways for intervention were blocked at every level. The Sith leveraged public fear to maintain control. Ongoing separatist aggression justified the continuation of emergency policies. The Jedi understood that challenging Palpatine during an active war would appear reckless. Strategic timing therefore became impossible. Any intervention risked deepening instability and delegitimizing the Order. The Jedi's philosophical constraints played a subtle but significant role. Their commitment to restraint prevented preemptive action. They avoided political influence due to long-standing norms that discouraged involvement in governance. These doctrines discouraged decisive measures, even when evidence of authoritarianism increased. Mace Windu's decision to confront Palpatine occurred only when all other options were exhausted. Even then, the Council acted without Senate approval, indicating that they recognized the legal risks. Their decision demonstrated institutional desperation, not confidence. They intervened because inaction had become untenable, not because conditions were favorable. Palpatine's manipulation of institutional design rendered the Jedi's late intervention ineffective. The Republic's judicial systems, military command structure, and legislative mechanisms all responded to the Chancellor. Organizational dependencies ensured that any attempt to remove him would trigger systemic resistance. The Jedi could act only outside formal channels, which weakened their legitimacy. The Sith outplayed the Jedi at the structural level. Palpatine didn't rely on superior insight, but on superior positioning. He shaped the environment so that the Jedi's predictive models, legal authority, and institutional procedures all malfunctioned simultaneously. By the time they identified him as a Sith Lord, the Republic's power structure had already aligned entirely with his objectives. The Jedi's inability to arrest Palpatine sooner reflected a system in which meaningful action was procedurally impossible. Palpatine controlled military assets, political processes, and public perception. The Jedi controlled none of these. Their strategic position collapsed not because they lacked awareness, but because the Sith had reshaped every pathway for intervention. Ultimately, the Jedi were defeated by design. Palpatine constructed a political landscape in which any attempt at self-defense appeared illegitimate. He reframed constitutional authority, redefined wartime necessity, and redirected public trust. The Jedi were outplayed long before they recognized the full extent of the threat, and by the time they acted, institutional collapse was already predetermined.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars, And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.